very pleased to join you today, and I have to say I do reflect back on my involvement, my past involvement in planning, and it's something that I greatly enjoyed. I think it was for about 13 years in a range of capacities, and believe it or not, I actually have quite a respect for planners and the importance of the role that they hold. But I might not go quite as far as your colleagues from Fife is at the centre of the universe, I think was the quote, but maybe just just slightly on the periphery of the centre perhaps, but certainly very, very important. I'd also recognise, I don't know if there's any elected members here, probably maybe ones that were, certainly when the Minister was here, but I also, I suppose, recognise the challenges that go with planning, and particularly, I suppose, some of the challenges that go for elected members and some of the difficulties they have as members of planning committees. I think the other thing, of course, particularly for elected members, maybe to some extent for planners, it's not always universally the most popular role, because ultimately you have to make hard decisions, and you've got to make decisions based on policy and plans, and it's about objectivity, and I know that can be quite challenging for some councillors. Perhaps that's maybe why I've now become chairman of SNH. I just wanted to do something that was much, much more popular than being a chairman of a planning committee. But I would emphasise the importance that goes with planning in terms of that clarity, that consistency, a degree of certainty, and the way in which you sort of conduct yourself, and particularly in terms of professional planners, in an objective way. And clearly crucial to that is effective leadership that gives clear direction in terms of how that policy is delivered and how it's implemented, and certainly that's very much where I'm coming from. In terms of what I hope to cover over the next 15 or so minutes, I don't really want to alarm Malcolm too much, but someone has produced 19 slides for me, Malcolm, but I always like to put a chair at his ease when I say that. But anyway, this is roughly what I want to cover, but I'll try and sort of move through it fairly quickly. I think in terms of the overview, in terms of the thrust of what I want to say, it's very much about how important SNH sees the planning system and our contribution to the planning system, and how much we want to see that our contribution is very much positive and constructive. So that would be, from my mind, the key overview in terms of these points. As far as a sort of a starting point for us, really, we have to relate everything in terms of our high-level aims. And if you look at some of our strategy document, then what you'll see there is, particularly on the right-hand side, is a summary of these key priorities. Now, I'm not going to read through them, you can read through them yourself, but if I were to sort of pick on some points there, I think the key thing for me, it's about public value, it's about public benefits, it's about influencing, I suppose, where people would choose to live and work and getting a positive experience out of that. It's about the quality of that experience as well, and very, very importantly, it's about the contribution to the wider Scottish economy. So there's an awful lot of I think, positive linkage there for all of us in this room, and that is reflected in terms of these core priorities that Scottish Natural Heritage have. And it's about how the planning system, this is from our perspective, how the planning system can help us to achieve those aims. And I'm just going to maybe look at 3 or 4 slides to try and sort of illustrate that a little bit further. But if we wanted to summarise it, it is about sustainable economic growth. And the Minister made reference to that on a couple of occasions, so it's the same for us. And can I just emphasise the S word there, the sustainable word. I think often that's used in a very loose and general way, but I think that's a very, very important part of that phrase, and it's about giving that true meaning. And certainly, just going back to my days in Highland Council, I was quite involved in sustainability issues for a number of years, and it is about embedding that, making it real, and I will also say it, and it's about an awful lot more than just green considerations as well. Wealth generation, economic development is an important part of it too. Anyway, in terms of just some examples, some of you may just recognise this slide. This actually is a location about 9 miles from the centre of Glasgow. It's the Kilpatrick Hills, and it's a special landscape area. But the point I'm trying to make here is that these areas exist. These areas also exist close to built-up urban areas. But in terms of planning, and particularly in terms of spatial planning, there's an awful lot that you can contribute, local authorities contribute, policy contribute in terms of, I suppose, helping us achieve a high quality nature and a high quality landscape asset. And our emphasis is on the resilience of that asset. It's not necessarily just about a resistance to change, it's the way in which it can cope with appropriate change. But you know, this in fact reflects quite a lot of combined work. I think 3 local authorities work together in terms of taking forward a study on this area. And again, that's probably an important message and theme that I just want to probably return to on a few occasions. It's about collaboration and partnership. And again, that's something that we in SNH certainly want to be party to. Another important emphasis is really in terms of, you know, what people gain in terms of the benefit of place. And certainly we're very clear that good planning can help protect nature and landscapes. And what that can then do in terms of what people can get from that is a better place for people to live, to work, to visit. And there is no doubt that in terms of development planning, it's an absolute key in terms of delivering good green networks and good green infrastructure. And I think hopefully some of that will be reinforced in terms of some of the MPF and SPP statements will be coming out later on this month. This picture I think is actually taken just outside Greenock, and I think the point I would try to reinforce there is that this is about delivering wider public benefits. And when I'm talking about wider public benefits, you know, access to green space, access to countryside space, that can make an enormous contribution in terms of people's health, their well-being, their attitude to their community, the sustainability of that community, and also of course just promoting that as an area where people would like to live, but also where people like to work and people would like to invest in. And mention was made of the Central Scotland Green Network. Well, we're very actively involved in the Central Scotland Green Network. It was SNH and the Forestry Commission working with a whole range of local authorities that sought to promote that. And again, that's about bringing those benefits across almost the whole of the central belt of Scotland. And there's another, I suppose, message. It's not just about rural areas, it's about urban areas, and that's particularly important in terms of the Scottish population as a whole. Also about trying to promote people's enjoyment and access to the countryside. This picture, I think, is from the West Highland Way. And good planning can certainly provide opportunities for more people to experience, enjoy and value nature and landscapes. And clearly through development plans, that can be a massive sort of push and motivation to make that happen. And clearly that also links into some important policy areas at the moment, linked to land reform and community empowerment and greater community control. And that's certainly very, very relevant in terms of certain announcements that have been made or are about to be made. Just one I wanted to mention because it links in. Some of you, I'm sure, in this room have been involved with the John Muir Way. That was recently launched by the First Minister just about a month and a half ago. You know, that's about roughly 140 miles of new pathway for walking, cycling, even using horses in some parts of it. You know, right through the central belt of Scotland, from Dunbar to Helensburgh, linking a whole range of urban areas and also deprived areas, and about promoting all of these principles. And that was brought about by partnership. I've got 10 plus local authorities down. I can't remember the precise number, but a great many local authorities came together, worked with national agencies, worked with landowners to make that happen. So, you know, it demonstrates what can be achieved. And clearly, just to go back to the point about the Scottish economy and the contribution that it can make and the importance of nature and landscapes in terms of the Scottish economy. And clearly, a key consideration is that the planning system can help natural assets contribute more to the Scottish economy. Just a couple of examples. I mean, the most obvious one is clearly around tourism, and I'm sure you'll know the stats on this, but nature-based tourism is worth about £1.4 billion a year, roughly about 39,000 full-time equivalent jobs directly related to nature-based tourism, and some 40% of all tourism spending in Scotland is linked to nature. But it goes beyond that. I mean, just coincidentally today we're launching a consultation on peatland and peatland management, and if you don't know it, and many people perhaps don't, about 20% of the Scottish land covered has peat on it. not necessarily peat in the best condition. But the reason that it's relevant is that, for example, 70% of our fresh water comes from a peatland system. Now, if you just want to pick one example of the relevance of that, the whisky industry is entirely dependent on that. A very, very important sector. So it's these linkage between nature and very significant employers, very significant contributors to the Scottish economy. And I mean, a phrase that I'm sure you're all familiar with is the one of ecosystem services and the idea of natural capital. And I think there's going to be more and more emphasis on that type of language in the future. But in terms of delivering that, realising that natural capital in the planning system and planning strategies are absolutely crucial. In terms of our involvement, the emphasis now is very much on upstream involvement. I just want to say a few words on that. And it's the way in which SNH will engage. And there was a very conscious shift by the board about 2012, and from that point onwards it was very much about influencing development plans, getting involved in pre-application discussion. And the attitude is one about a solution focus, and certainly moving away from an assumption that SNH are there to provide objections. And I'll show a few metrics a little bit later on which hopefully reinforces that point. And linked to that as an organisation about being very committed to planning reform and contributing to that planning reform. And just as a couple of examples, you'll recognise this in terms of the NPF. I mean, SNH had a very early engagement in terms of a number of national strategic plans. In terms of NPF 3, we had a significant involvement. We weren't just a consultee, we were actively engaged in terms of the early stages, and we welcomed that opportunity. And a number of things certainly are within the draft, and I think there's a few hints from the Minister in terms of what will be announced later on in the year. And we valued that, and we think there's great benefits that come from that. In the same way, just a brief mention of strategic environmental assessment. We think this is a key role, and we think it's an important part in terms of the evidence base that moves towards plan making. We see that it provides evidence in terms of making decisions, and it's not, it's not, as someone put it to me, it's not just a compliance exercise in its own right. So the key message here is about that early collaboration and the appropriate involvement in SNH in terms of helping that process. A little bit just in terms of supporting placemaking. Now, this slide, I think, relates to a workshop which I think was facilitated with Fife Council. And it was very much to help them identify green networks, and so we value that opportunity to be involved and make a contribution. And I suppose the message here is, that there's a willingness to get involved. We can see the benefits of early engagement and development plans. We actually think it gives us the chance to have more positive influence. Clearly, it's ultimately for local authorities and their strategic planning committees to make decisions, or full council committees to make decisions. But we also happen to think that, that planners, and I think the word visionary was used in the earlier presentation from the Minister, I fully sign up to that. I think you have an incredibly important role in terms of promoting that positive vision, and I think it demonstrates just how key the role of professional planners is, and we are very keen to contribute to that. Also, I think linked to that is the involvement with communities. Now, that can be very, very challenging, and design charrettes were mentioned on a number of occasions. There's no doubt that reflects political will, but it's also a very, very important opportunity, but it can be extremely challenging to make it real, and again, there was earlier reference to that. In terms of the work in Fife, this is just an example, I think, of one of the outputs, and I think this is part of the supplementary guidance on green networks. It's one of the excerpts. But this is one of the consequences of that early engagement, the positive outputs that can come from it. And it's about existing green networks, and it's also the enhancement in terms of future green networks. In terms of our engagement now, it should be selective. Particularly when we move on to development management, it should be about sites which are significant in terms of their international importance, perhaps linked to a Natura site. But the opportunity clearly is through the development plans, but it's also through guidance, and again the production of collaborative guidance, and there just are some examples there. Also, the effective use of pre-application advice. But getting things right at an early stage, giving a degree of certainty, and I suppose avoiding dealing with problems at a later stage. And certainly we are very keen to support and promote pre-application advice, and I think we're very supportive of a more formal, coordinated approach to that, which I think many of, perhaps all of you are doing, but I just want to put that on the record. And that then links into the whole enabling approach linked to regulatory reform, and I know that certain ministers are very, very keen on the principle of that enabling approach, particularly linked to renewables. I said I would say a little bit about metrics, so there's just a sort of a summary there. I'm not going to go through all of that in detail, but the key points I wanted to emphasise there is we don't get involved in that many applications. Someone told me there's about 40,000 roughly of planning applications in Scotland, and we're consulted in about 1,600. And if you sort of follow that through, you can see that in terms of advice, no comment, and ultimately objections, there's about 10 objections ultimately. And I think one of the things that SNH have in common with planning authorities is there's an awful lot of perception out there, but the reality sometimes can be slightly different. I'm not suggesting that, don't mean there's the odd challenging moment, but the perception can certainly override the reality. And of course, hopefully this helps in terms of, well, certainly the challenge that was laid down by the Minister in terms of performance and particularly in terms of timescales. Not suggesting we've cracked it entirely, but clearly, we have to work together to take that forward. And one of the points I would emphasise, I am very keen that we, SNH, also look at performance improvement, which we are doing. We look at how we can work more effectively in terms of joint working, and also that we have a clear understanding of what customers want, particularly some sort of the key sectoral customers, and we're doing a lot of work in that direction and very happy to do that with you. Just in terms of just some comments, and I'm not going to sort of dwell on this. I think the comment at the top is Scottish renewables, and clearly that's important in terms of a key sector. The middle comment I think actually does come from a cover note from Derek Mackay, and it relates to a performance report. And the final comment is based on a survey that we did in 2012. I think it reflects some about 127 respondents. But it's important that we do have a feel for what people are saying out there, and that we do take an objective approach to it, and that we listen and respond to the comments that are made. We're also undertaking some research into outcomes, and that will be published later on this month. And again, some of these comments sort of relate to some of these points. And it would seem that in terms of, there are some positive results that are now coming forward in terms of the upstream engagement, and our own analysis seems to come out with some fairly supportive and positive results. You'll notice in the third point there, and I'll return to this in a moment, but there still seems to be perhaps some challenges that exist over basically habitat improvement, actually the benefit that we're actually getting in terms of improvement in natural heritage. So there's maybe some things that we have to work harder in that respect. Now, an awful lot of positives there, I think justifiable positives, but we must recognise that we've got to take a wider panoramic view, and clearly there are challenges out there as well. Challenges for us as an organisation, challenges for us collectively. And I'm not going to go through these in enormous detail, but just to pick on two or three of them. One is, I think, just this alignment between a range of strategies. And the ones I was going to mention would be, for instance, how does NPF, how does it integrate with things like land use strategy, Scottish biodiversity strategy? I think the Minister made a very valid point, the link with community planning. There's going to be even more emphasis on that. So again, it's getting that effective alignment. I'm not suggesting there's a contradiction, but it's important that it's actually strongly focused and positive. Also, I suppose, how we join up. That's join up as an organisation, but also how planning authorities join up. Now, there are some very good examples where things go across boundaries, and of course things with green networks don't stop at a local authority boundary, just using that as one example. So it's how we can promote the work that goes well beyond that. And I think there's a lot of examples of how that happens, Central Scotland Green Network being one in itself. How we embrace regulatory reform and make it even more real. And the point I was making about biodiversity, and I think working together, there's more that we can do in that direction. How we join up, how we promote opportunity, how we realise some of those opportunities, particularly around biodiversity improvement. I thought I'd finish just with some personal reflections. Some of them, I suppose, loosely linked to leadership, but they're really just a list of observations. And I hope it's very obvious in everything I've said, but just to reinforce it, For me, planning is a vehicle for positive development. That's always been my view. And it makes things happen, and it makes good things happen. And linked to that, I think it can and does enhance the environment, although I think there are more opportunities there. I also believe that enhancement of the environment is fully compatible with good planning. In fact, they can work together, they're complementary. I think there's a need for even more effective engagement with communities and stakeholders. That has to be a multi-way process, but that can be extremely challenging. But we need to work harder at how we can do that, and to ensure that we're even more inclusive. And it's about explicit listening as well in terms of how we do that. Just to state the obvious, development is necessary. There is a need for positive change. There are opportunities that we need to create for the Scottish economy and the Scottish people. We need to work effectively together to make that happen, and I'm determined that we'll build even more in terms of how we can achieve that. And it's about maintaining and ensuring good and open communication, and again I'm committed to that. And there will be challenges, there will be tensions from time to time, so it's also about maintaining mechanisms to resolve challenges. That's usually about talking to people and avoid sending emails that can be FOI'd, just as an incidental point. I wish I hadn't had that recorded there. I forgot I was being recorded there. Thanks very much. Of course, we're an open and transparent organisation. So. And I think the thing that makes that happen is collaboration and positive leadership. And certainly we as a body are very happy to contribute to that. So thank you all very much.